So we're going to take a little look into the endocrine system. The endocrine system is the second controlling system of the human body, the nervous system being first. Remember, the nervous system operates via electrical communication, whereas the endocrine system operates via chemical communication. The endocrine system uses little tiny chemical messengers that we call hormones. These hormones are released directly into the bloodstream, where they're going to target a specific target cell that has the correct receptor on it. Hormones are going to control several major processes of the body. One of them being reproduction. When you think about estrogen, you think about testosterone and those various hormones and the effects they have on the human body. Also going to trigger growth and development when you think about growth hormone. Mobilization of our body defenses also helps maintain much of our homeostasis, as far as our water balance inside of us, as far as our glucose regulation inside of our body as well. And just regulation of our metabolism in general, through that T3, T4 hormones, and speeding up the rate at which we're able to break down fat and increase our body temperature and basically increase production of actual ATP itself. Just a reminder that the hormones are going to be produced by specialized cells. We call these cells endocrine glands. These cells are going to secrete their actual hormones directly into the extracellular fluid that surrounds these actual glands, and then these are uptaken by the actual bloodstream themselves. So hormones are released basically into this extracellular fluid that's just transferred in the actual bloodstream itself, and hormones travel via the actual bloodstream. And then these hormones are going to go to target cells that have a correct receptor on them. These hormones are going to cause a drastic change in that cell, whether it's going to cause that cell to produce something brand new. It's going to cause that cell to stop producing something, but that cell is going to behave differently when that hormone binds onto that particular receptor that's on the actual surface itself. How do we structurally classify hormones? We structurally classify them as proteins, peptides, and amines. And then some of these hormones are actually steroid-based. And then some of them are actually lipid-based as well. But for the most part, most hormones that we talk about in here are this protein-based hormones that we're dealing with in our class, human body systems. Hormones, you have to remember, they only affect certain tissues or organs of the body. These organs or tissues that have the correct receptor that's on the actual surface itself, and then this hormone is going to bind and it's going to alter that cellular activity of that particular cell or that tissue or that organ that it's actually binding to. If that cell or tissue or organ doesn't have that receptor on it, then you're going to have absolutely nothing that's going to change about it. So it has to have that specific receptor for that hormone to kind of fit like a lock and key in order for that change to actually occur. What can happen when a hormone binds to this receptor? It can cause its changes in the plasma membrane permeability, or the whole entire electrical state of that particular cell, tissue, or organ. It can cause it to actually build new proteins, such as enzymes or things like that. It's also going to cause activation or inactivation of enzymes. So it's going to increase the actual, likelihood that this enzyme is going to actually work, or it's going to prevent this enzyme from actually working altogether. It can also stimulate mitosis, cells to begin to divide, and growth can occur. And it also can promote the secretory activity of those particular cells and cause those cells to produce something completely different and release that product that they're actually producing. Most hormonic activity is controlled by negative feedback. Remember, with negative feedback, we're going away from that initial stimuli. So let's say that initial stimuli is I have high blood glucose levels. I want to go away from that initial stimuli to where I have a lower level or a normal level of blood glucose levels. A stimulus too low or hormonal levels in the blood triggers the release of more hormones. What that basically means is that if I have low hormone levels in my blood, that can trigger my body to notice that and then stimulate the actual release of more of these particular hormones inside of my blood. Once the proper level of hormones has been reached in my actual blood itself, then we stop or we inhibit the release of any more hormones to kind of control it that particular way. The way that we can get hormones to be released throughout the whole entire body, the first way that we have is basically is regulated by other hormones. We call this tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are hormones that trigger the release of other hormones from other endocrine glands. Most of your tropic hormones are produced by the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and basically the anterior pituitary is going to basically release these hormones, and these hormones are going to travel to another gland, and basically they're going to cause that gland to then to release its particular hormone. So when we take a look at like what's truly the master gland in the human body, there's much of a debate, but that's between the hypothalamus and the pituitary because they release these they release these hormones that are targeted for other endocrine glands of the body. Remember, we call these hormones that are targeted for other endocrine glands of the body, we call them tropic hormones. This is just an example in this diagram here. You can see that this is the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary is releasing these various tropic hormones. They're going to have an effect on these other glands that are down here and cause them to release their particular hormones themselves. So this is an example of hormonal stimuli as a result of the actual hypothalamus and the pituitary releasing these particular tropic type hormones or releasing hormones themselves. The second way that I can get a hormone to actually be released in the actual human body itself is basically humoral stimuli. And what that means is it's basically the changing the certain ions or certain chemicals that are actually in the blood itself. If these levels tend to change, then that's going to cause a hormone to be released. A prime example of this is going to be your insulin and glucagon. Basically in the pancreas, you're monitoring the levels of the actual blood glucose levels that you have. If these glucose levels go too high, then of course insulin is going to be released. If these glucose levels are too low, then you're going to have glucagon that's going to be released. But these are basically humoral levels that are going to dictate whether a hormone gets released or not. As you can see, this is an example that we're depicting in this particular picture with the parathyroid and the thyroid gland, in which the levels of calcium are going to dictate whether we release this this particular hormone, this parathyroid hormone, or calcitonin hormone into the actual bloodstream. But these are humoral stimuli that's causing the actual release of this particular hormone. The third way that I can get a hormone to be released is through neural stimuli. And this is just a direct nerve impulse firing into the actual gland itself, causing that particular hormone to be released. Most of these are under the control of the sympathetic division of the nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic division is kind of the fight or flight response that you have to kick you into actual high gear. An example of this is when you're in this fight or flight state, your sympathetic nervous system fires directly into the adrenal gland, which causes the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine. And this is going to cause things like your heartbeat to increase and all those different types of effects, increased blood flow to your muscles and all those fight or flight responses that we have when we're in crisis mode. This is an example right here, and you can see in the picture that the central nervous system is directly firing into the actual adrenal gland itself and getting norepinephrine and epinephrine to be released. This is an example of neural stimuli causing the actual hormones to be released. So you can see, guys, we have three different ways in which hormones are released. The first way is through other hormones. The second way that we have is through the actual humoral levels, and then the third way is through neural stimuli, is how I can get these actual hormones to be released into the actual body itself. Remember, hormones travel via the actual bloodstream to that particular target cell that contains the correct receptor that's on it. The next thing we're going to talk about is the major endocrine organs that we have. Remember, the major endocrine organs are endocrine glands. These are the major glands that we have, and for your test, you're going to have to know these major glands. I would also know their location and be able to identify them on kind of a diagram of the actual human being itself with those glands being shown. The first gland we have is the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, the adrenal glands, the pineal gland, the thymus gland, the pancreas, the gonads, and then the hypothalamus. These are the major endocrine organs or major endocrine glands that we're going to deal with in human body systems and in this unit 2.3. We'll also touch base on some of these glands later on in the actual class itself. But these are the major ones that you've got to know for the test coming up. This is a diagram of these major glands and their actual locations. I would know where these actual glands are located at for your particular test. So the ones that tend to be a little bit more difficult that kids don't know where they're at is the pineal gland. Remember, the pineal gland is on the back of the actual epithalamus itself that we talked about when we talked about the nervous system. Right here is the hypothalamus, and then you have the pituitary gland that hangs off the actual hypothalamus. In your neck region, you have the thyroid gland that's hanging out. If I took this thyroid gland and I peeled it back, you'd see a mass of other glandular tissue that's behind the actual thyroid itself, and that's called the parathyroid gland. The thymus is hanging out in the chest cavity itself. Right around the actual heart itself is where we find the actual thymus. On top of the actual kidneys, on top of the kidneys, we have the adrenal glands that are sitting, and then we have the pancreas is sitting here. And we studied the pancreas a little bit earlier, and in PBS, you guys talked about the pancreas itself when we talked about the insulin and type 1 diabetes in actual PBS. And then you can see the ovaries, which are in a female, and then males have testes as well. But these are the major endocrine glands that are responsible for knowing and be able to identify on a test that we have upcoming. So the first major gland that we have is the pituitary gland. Like I said, it hangs off the actual hypothalamus. It's protected by a bone that's called the sphenoid bone, so it is kind of protected by the sphenoid bone. It has two primary lobes, and in class we talked about these two primary lobes that are on the actual anterior pituitary. The first one is the two major lobes of the pituitary. The first part we have is the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is just glandular tissue, so it's completely glandular tissue. It's going to produce its own hormones. So the anterior pituitary produces all of its own hormones. The posterior pituitary is complete nervous tissue. So it's nervous tissue based when we look at the posterior pituitary. The key thing with the actual posterior pituitary is it's basically storing hormones that were produced by the hypothalamus. And then often in other classes, you may have heard of the pituitary gland being the actual master endocrine gland. That's kind of up for debate. Other teachers will tell you that the hypothalamus is the one that's really in control of the actual pituitary with the releasing hormones that it produces. But you may have heard of in previous classes the pituitary gland is called the master gland. There are 6 major anterior pituitary hormones. 2 are going to affect non-endocrine targets. This is growth hormone and prolactin. Okay, so these are the 2 non-tropic hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary. And then the other 4 are going to stimulate other endocrine glands. These are the major tropic hormones that are produced. You have thyroid stimulating hormone, which we call TSH. You have adrenocorticotropic hormones, and then you have the 2 gonadotropic hormones, which are luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone that are both produced by the anterior pituitary. All anterior pituitary hormones are proteins, and they're regulated by basically hormonal stimuli, and they're regulated mostly by negative feedback. The way that we control them by hormonal stimuli, a lot of times the hypothalamus is going to release what we call the actual releasing hormones, and then these releasing hormones are going to cause the release of hormones by the actual anterior pituitary. Here's a picture of the anterior pituitary. You can see the anterior pituitary sitting right here, and then the posterior pituitary sitting back here. Remember, the anterior pituitary is just consistent of actual glandular tissue, and you can see the hypothalamus sits right up above it right here, and then the posterior pituitary sitting right back here. And then here are all the major hormones that are produced by the actual anterior pituitary and their targets as far as organs are concerned, or where they're going to bind onto when they're actually released into the bloodstream. The first hormone that we have that we talked a little bit about in class when we talked about the actual Lincoln Grant activity was growth hormone. And growth hormone is a general metabolic hormone. Basically, it's going to cause increased growth of the actual bone itself and skeletal muscle. So it's going to cause increased growth or increased size of that particular cells when we take a look at them. It plays a role in determining your final body size. It's going to play a role in determining your final body size because this is a hormone that's released during your actual development and encourages this growth of our actual muscle and bone itself. Growth hormone is also going to cause fats to be broken down for a source of energy, so it can be a great product for being able to decrease the amount of fat and increase the actual muscle development itself. Some disorders that we have associated with growth hormone. The first one we have is pituitary dwarfism, and this is hyposecretion or lack of secretion of growth hormone during childhood. A person that has pituitary dwarfism, they're going to be very short in stature because their cells were not bathed with this growth hormone, and they did not have the ability then to be able to encourage this growth in muscle and bone. Gigantism is just the opposite of pituitary dwarfism, and gigantism is basically the hypersecretion of growth hormone during childhood, and this individual is going to be extremely larger than their counterparts or the average human being, because their cells have been bathed with this growth hormone during their actual development. Now, if I release this hormone after my growth and development during adulthood, I have a disorder that's called acromegaly. And acromegaly don't necessarily increase in size, but the thickness of the actual bones themselves, they become a lot thicker in the actual individual itself. When we took a look at 3.2, 3.2.2 in the case of Lincoln Grant. Lincoln Grant was an individual that we studied that had this acromegaly disorder, in which his bones were actually thickening in actual size itself. Here's a picture that I gave you guys in class. You can see this individual right here that's really tall has gigantism. Remember, gigantism is the actual hypersecretion of growth hormone during your growth and development. And this individual right here has pituitary dwarfism, which is the actual hyposecretion of growth hormone during your developmental years. The next hormone that we have that's released by the anterior pituitary is called prolactin. Prolactin is going to stimulate and maintain milk production following the actual childbirth. It's also produced in males, but the function in males is basically unknown. So this is basically for females, and what prolactin does is it's going to actually encourage milk to be produced in the actual mammary glands following the actual birth of an actual child. Adrenocorticotropic hormones are going to stimulate the adrenal glands, and basically it's going to regulate the endocrine activity of the adrenal cortex, or the outside of that particular adrenal gland that sits on top of the kidney. Thyroid stimulating hormone is also called TSH. It influences the growth and activity of the thyroid gland. So TSH is going to actually target the thyroid gland and then cause the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4 hormone. Just a reminder that the thyroid stimulating hormone, in order for it to be released, there's another hormone that's secreted by the hypothalamus that's called TRH, or thyroid releasing hormone. So it goes TRH to TSH, and then TSH causes the thyroid to release T3 and T4. So you can see in this example that I'm giving you right now that the hypothalamus really has control over that particular anterior pituitary gland. We have gonadotropic hormones that we talked about. We have FSH and LH. FSH and LH are going to basically stimulate follicle development in ovaries. In males, FSH, that's in females. In males, FSH is going to stimulate sperm development in the actual testes. And then luteinizing hormone is going to trigger ovulation of the egg in females. And then in males, it's going to stimulate testosterone production. And then also, which is eventually going to lead to the actual development of a young boy becoming a man with these hormones when they're released, and they're targeting for the ovaries and the actual testes to cause estrogen or other androgens to be released. We talked a little bit about the hypothalamus and how the hypothalamus really has control over the actual pituitary itself. The hypothalamus releases a variety of basically inhibiting hormones and releasing hormones. If I see the term releasing hormones, a lot of times a releasing hormone is targeted for the anterior pituitary, and it's going to cause that anterior pituitary then to release its particular hormones. So when we take a look at the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus has great control over the actual anterior pituitary itself. Some of the releasing hormones that we talked about in class are GHRH. GHRH is growth hormone releasing hormone. GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then TRH is that thyrotropin releasing hormone. But this growth hormone releasing hormone is going to be released, and it's going to cause the anterior pituitary then to release growth hormone. When growth hormones then release, growth hormone is going to then bind to muscles and bones of the body and cause increased development of those particular types of things. There's also two other hypothalamic hormones that are not these inhibiting and releasing hormones. These are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. When we take a look up here at this, I talked a little bit about the releasing hormones that are up here. Inhibiting hormones, what they do is they prevent the release of other hormones. So if I see the term inhibiting hormone, it's basically preventing the release of another hormone, is what an inhibiting hormone does. And a releasing hormone encourages the release of a particular hormone itself. These three hormones, this GHRH, GnRH, and TRH, you're also going to be responsible for knowing on your test. Remember, with the hypothalamus produces hormones, but the hypothalamus stores its hormones in the actual posterior pituitary. So it's oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are going to be stored in the posterior pituitary. You may have heard of the antidiuretic hormone. It's also called vasopressin. This here I'm talking a little bit about, again, the posterior pituitary is not an endocrine gland, but it does release hormones. And how this relationship actually works out, the hypothalamus is composed of both nervous tissue and it's also composed of glandular endocrine tissue. And basically what it does is it directly fires neurons into the actual posterior pituitary to get it to actually release those particular hormones themselves. So just a reminder, the posterior pituitary is a storage ground or a storage area for hormones that were produced by the hypothalamus. This oxytocin is going to stimulate contractions of the uterus during labor, sexual relations, and breastfeeding. This causes the actual milk ejection in an actual nursing woman as well. Remember we previously talked about with prolactin. Prolactin is going to stimulate the actual milk to be produced, and then the oxytocin is going to help encourage the milk to actually be released to the actual infant itself. Oxytocin is also, like I said, going to stimulate the actual contractions during child labor in order for child delivery to take place. Sometimes they will give the female in labor and delivery, they'll give them oxytocin to help encourage the actual delivery or the birth of the child. Antidiuretic hormone, this is also called vasopressin. Basically, this inhibits the actual kidneys from releasing water. So it's going to encourage you guys to actually retain water inside of your body. A lot of times when you're dehydrated, antidiuretic hormone is going to be released to try to conserve water. And this is what vasopressin does. It also causes vasoconstriction, and this can also lead to an increase in actual blood pressure itself. Because we have lack of water inside of our body, so to keep our blood relatively consistent, we're going to have vasoconstriction and actually shrink down the size of these actual blood vessels themselves, so this fluid stays a little bit more consistent, or the flow of the actual blood stays relatively consistent throughout the body. Just remember, you may hear the term ADH, or you may hear the term vasopressin. They're actually the exact same thing when we take a look at them. Again, here you can see in this diagram here's the hypothalamus again, and then this hypothalamus is going to store its actual hormones in this posterior pituitary here, and then here's this anterior lobe itself that's associated with the actual pituitary gland itself. The thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is found at the base of the throat. It consists of two lobes. It's connecting at what we call the isthmus. There's two hormones that are produced by the thyroid gland. One is thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormones are commonly known as that T3 and T4 that we talked about. And then the second hormone is going to deal with calcium levels. It's called calcitonin. This is the thyroid gland that's here. You guys put the thyroid gland on your actual mannequins as well as the pituitary gland. The thyroid gland kind of looks like a butterfly a little bit, or it kind of looks like a bow tie itself, but this is the thyroid gland here that you guys also put that on your actual mannequin itself. Thyroid hormone is your major metabolic hormone. It's composed of two active iodine-containing hormones, T3 and T4, and these are going to be secreted by the actual thyroid gland themselves. In order for T3 and T4 to be produced, remember the hypothalamus has to release thyroid-releasing hormone, which causes the anterior pituitary to release thyroid-secreting hormone, which then causes the thyroid to release T3 and T4. Remember, when T3 and T4 are released, it's going to target a lot of your body cells or a lot of your major body organs, and basically it's going to increase body temperature. It's going to increase production of ATP. It's going to increase the ability of your body to break down fat in order to increase the ability to build more ATP. So basically, this is increasing your whole entire metabolism. Remember, metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions going on in your body. When you have high levels of T3 and T4 running through your body itself, you have an increased level of chemical reactions going on in your actual body itself. This is just an example of the follicle cells as to where these T3 and T4 hormones are going to be produced at. Some of the thyroid disorders that we have, in order for these thyroid hormones to be produced, iodine must be present. And And without iodine present, you can't produce any of these thyroid hormones. We used to be known back in the day, because in order to get iodine in your body, you have to eat like shellfish, or marine organisms. And we used to be known as the goiter belt way back in the day, because we didn't have easy access to this seafood. But now, if you look at our actual salt itself, it says iodized salt on it, and that iodine allows us to produce our thyroid hormones themselves. But a goiter can develop if you don't get this iodine in your body, because you don't have the ability to produce this T3 and T4 hormone. So basically what happens is you have TRH is going to be released, and then TSH is going to be released. When this TSH is released, it's going to be continually released into the thyroid, where the thyroid has no ability to respond to this excess buildup of TSH, of the TSH. So you wind up with what's called an actual goiter itself. And this is an individual here that has a goiter, because they didn't have the ability, or they didn't have iodine in their actual diet. So this is a goiter. This occurs because you're not getting iodine in your diet. And remember, iodine is needed to produce these thyroid hormones. The second thing we have is creatinism, and this is going to be caused by a hyposecretion, or a lack of secretion of this thyroxine hormone, and this can cause dwarfism during the actual childhood itself. Hyperthyroidism can cause basically physical and mental sluggishness. Another disorder, I don't really address this one on the actual test itself. Another disorder that you may have heard of is Graves' disease, and this is basically hyperthyroidism. This one's hypothyroidism, if I mispronounce that. This is hypothyroidism. But in hyperthyroidism, basically this is going to increase your metabolism in Graves' disease, and basically you're going to have a rapid heartbeat. You're going to have significant weight loss, is what you're going to have. They have a little bit of bulging of their actual eyeballs themselves too, when you look at the actual individual that has Graves' disease. So it's hard for this person to actually put on weight, and they constantly have a heart that's constantly running at a relatively fast pace. This is the eyeballs of an individual with Graves' disease. You can see they're kind of bulging out of the actual head itself. Thyroid gland also produces calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to decrease blood calcium levels by causing the actual calcium to go out of the bloodstream and then get deposited into actual bone itself. The opposite of calcitonin is parathyroid hormone. Remember, you have the actual thyroid gland itself, and the thyroid gland produces the calcitonin. Behind the thyroid gland on the backside, you have these parathyroid glands that produce parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone is going to take the calcium out of the actual bone itself. Sorry about that. The announcements came on there a little bit for the end of the day, but basically the parathyroid hormone is going to be released by the actual parathyroid gland, and it's going to cause calcium to be taken out of the actual bone and then deposited in the actual bloodstream itself. Remember, you need calcium in your body for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons that you need calcium is in order to enable muscles to be able to have the actual ability to contract. That's one reason that we actually have calcium. Like I said, here's the parathyroid gland itself, and I talked a little bit about the parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone is the exact opposite of the actual calcitonin, and that parathyroid hormone is going to take calcium out of your bone and then deposit it into your actual bloodstream itself. This is the feedback loop, and you will have to know this feedback loop for the actual test itself. You can see as it has rising blood calcium levels, the thyroid is going to detect this difference in the humoral levels in the actual blood itself, and it's going to release calcium, and then this excess calcium is going to be released or deposited into actual bone itself. So we took calcium out of the bloodstream and we put it into the actual bone. thus lowering the amount of calcium that's in our actual blood itself and returning it back to normal. Now, the exact opposite is going to actually happen then when I have low calcium levels inside of my blood. The parathyroid gland is going to detect this, and the parathyroid gland then is going to release parathyroid hormone. This parathyroid hormone is going to cause a specific cell called an osteoclast, which is a bone cell that breaks down bone, and it's going to release this calcium into the bloodstream, thus returning our actual blood calcium levels back to normal. So I would study this feedback loop pretty well and have a great understanding for it on your actual test that's coming up. The adrenal glands, they sit on top of the actual kidneys itself. You have the adrenal cortex, which is the outer region of the actual adrenal gland. Then you have a middle region, which is called the adrenal medulla, and this is neural tissue. The glandular tissue sits on the actual adrenal cortex of the actual kidneys themselves. Basically, you have two similar hormones that are produced by the adrenal medulla, and basically these hormones are epinephrine and norepinephrine, and basically epinephrine and norepinephrine are commonly known as, we kind of call these adrenaline together, so we kind of call epinephrine and norepinephrine are kind of cause this adrenaline together, and this is going to cause your fight or flight response when you have your sympathetic nervous system fires directly into this particular gland to get these actual hormones to be released. And basically you're going to have increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased blood glucose levels, so you can produce more ATP because you're in this actual crisis mode itself. Basically we're going to expand or open up the actual passageways to our lungs so we can get more air into them as well. But you guys all have an experience of when you've had this norepinephrine or epinephrine released into your body, and you've had that fight or flight response, which is what these hormones actually do. You can see right here, guys, is the actual kidneys themselves, and on top of the kidneys, this is where the adrenal gland sits. And you can see you have the adrenal medulla, which is the middle part here, and then the outer part is the actual cortex. The pancreas, you guys know the pancreas pretty much in and out because you guys studied this extensively in PBS. This was the very first feedback loop that we did when we started the whole entire unit itself. Just a reminder that you have two different islets that produce these. You have alpha cells and you have beta cells. Beta cells produce the actual insulin, and then glucagon is produced by the actual alpha cells. These two hormones act in direct opposites to one another, and that insulin is going to be released when you have actual high blood glucose levels. So when I have high blood glucose levels, basically insulin is going to be released, and it's going to allow body cells to take in more glucose. Now, glucagon has the opposite effect. Glucagon is going to be when you have low blood sugar levels, and basically when glucagon is released, it's going to target the liver. It's going to cause the liver to convert glycogen into actual glucose itself, and then that gets released in the actual bloodstream itself. There's your pancreas. There's where it kind of sits, kind of underneath the actual stomach, and right at the start of the actual small intestine is where we find the actual pancreas. These are the cells that are producing the particular insulin and glucagon. Remember, we have the alpha cells, and then we have the beta cells. Just a reminder that the alpha cells produce glucagon, the beta cells produce the insulin. This is the feedback loop that you guys have got to know for your actual test itself. And we've gone over this time and time again. I can see I have elevated blood sugar levels. The pancreas is going to detect this. It's going to release a hormone called insulin. Okay, and then the blood is going to then this is going to stimulate then these body cells to actually take in more glucose. Also, insulin is also going to cause the liver to also take up more glucose, and when it takes up more glucose, it converts the glucose into glycogen, and glycogen is our actual sugar reserves. That's where we store sugars in our liver, but glycogen is the form of sugar that we actually store itself, and then this is going to cause our blood glucose levels to decrease. Now, the actual opposite of this then is going to be I have low blood sugar levels. The pancreas will detect this humoral level of this change in the actual blood sugar levels of cells, and it's going to release a hormone called glucagon. Glucagon is going to cause the liver then to convert glycogen into glucose and then release it into the actual bloodstream itself. I would know this feedback loop pretty well for your test, because you're going to have to be able to draw it out come test time. Another gland that we have that sits on the back of the epithalamus that we talked about in the nervous system is the pineal gland. The pineal gland secretes a hormone that's called melatonin, and basically this is going to help establish the body's wake and sleep cycles. It's going to allow us to either basically go to bed, and it also decreased levels allows us or causes us to actually wake up. You may have guys been at GNC, and GNC sells like the herbal remedy for actual sleep, and if you look at the back of it, you'll see that melatonin is the hormone that's present in a lot of those herbal or sleep medications that you can get at those particular types of stores. Just remember, the pineal gland is sitting right back here. Is where the pineal gland sits, right on the back of the actual, by the third ventricle of the actual brain itself that we talked about during the actual nervous system. Thymus gland, we take a look at the thymus gland. The thymus gland is posterior to the actual sternum. Basically, this gland is very active in infants and children. It produces a hormone called thymosin, which allows some white blood cells to be able to mature. But basically, this is important in developing the actual immune system itself. The thymus gland really becomes inactive for the most part as you're done with your actual development stages of life. But the thymus gland tends to kick your immune system into actual high gear itself. The gonads, ovaries are going to produce eggs. They produce two groups of steroid hormones, estrogen and progesterone. These are going to make a female, and then the testes produce sperm, and they produce what we call androgens. Androgens are things like testosterone and things like that, and they basically make a man a man. You can see the ovaries and testes down here where they're actually located at. Estrogens are going to stimulate the actual development of secondary female characteristics, which are things like increased in breast development, and basically cause the maturation of the actual female reproductive organs themselves. With progesterone and estrogen, they also, like I said, promote the actual breast development, and it also regulates the actual menstrual cycle itself. Progesterone, like I just said, with estrogen is going to regulate the actual menstrual cycle. Also, progesterone alone is also going to help implementation of the actual embryo in the actual uterus. It's also going to help prepare the breast for lactation when we take a look at progesterone. The testes produce several androgens. We take a look at a man or a boy. Testosterone is the main one. It's responsible for developing of those male secondary sexual characteristics, things like having that deep voice, increasing that hyaline cartilage that lines the actual larynx itself, making that voice very deep. It's also going to promote the actual development and maturation of the male reproductive system. Testosterone, these androgens are also required for the sperm cell production in the actual male. These are the major ones that we talked about in this particular lecture. You have to remember too, as you guys go on into college and things like that, they'll also talk about other tissue inside of your body that has an endocrine function. There's parts of the small intestine, parts of the stomach, parts of the kidneys, parts of the heart. But these endocrine glands are scattered throughout the actual body itself. Remember, we take a look at the endocrine system. The endocrine system is dealing with endocrine glands, and endocrine glands produce hormones. Whereas an exocrine gland is not part of the endocrine system. Exocrine glands produce their products, and they don't release their products directly into the bloodstream, but they release their products into the actual ducts themselves. So an exocrine gland is something like a sweat gland. On your test, you're going to have to know the difference also between an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland, and that's just a friendly reminder. Remember, I encourage you guys to study hard. I've given you the actual review guide itself. Study that review guide that I gave you, and you can kind of go back through and kind of use this lecture as an actual refresher to help tie up any loose ends or any questions that you have. Remember, I am available. If you do have any questions, it's always a good idea, maybe prior to the test or a day or two before the test, to have any questions. Don't hesitate to ask me. Note cards also do relatively well for them. I'd also study your graphic organizer that you guys built in this particular unit itself.